September 14th, 1966. Amateur night at the Apollo becomes Jimi Hendrix's most humiliating moment. The crowd booed him off before he finished one song. April 1968, the Apollo theater manager personally flew to London to beg Jimi to come back. His return broke every attendance record in the venue's history. The Apollo Theater on 125th Street in Harlem was more than just a music venue. It was sacred ground. Since 1934, the Apollo had been the proving ground for black entertainers, the place where careers were made or destroyed by one of the most demanding audiences in America. Everyone from Ella Fitzgerald to James Brown had faced the Apollo crowd on amateur night, and those who survived went on to greatness. The rules at the Apollo were simple but unforgiving. You had to earn the audience's respect with authentic talent and genuine soul. The crowd could smell a fake from the balcony, and they had no patience for performers who didn't understand what real black music was supposed to sound like. September 14th, 1966 was a typical Wednesday night at the Apollo. Amateur night was in full swing, with hopeful performers lined up backstage, each dreaming of following in the footsteps of the legends who had graced that same stage. The audience was lively but not hostile. They wanted to see good performances, and they were prepared to be generous with their applause for anyone who deserved it. Among the amateur performers that night was a young man who called himself Jimi James. He was 23 years old, with a growing afro and clothes that suggested he'd spent too much time around white hippies in Greenwich Village. He carried a right-handed Fender Stratocaster that he played left-handed, and he had a confidence that some in the crowd immediately read as arrogance. Jimi James was, of course, Jimi Hendrix, though he wouldn't use that name for another month. He'd been playing the village club scene for months, developing a style that blended traditional blues with psychedelic rock and experimental feedback. His music was innovative and powerful, but it was also unlike anything that typically succeeded at the Apollo. When Jimi signed up for amateur night, he was motivated by more than just the chance to perform. He was seeking validation from his own community. He'd grown up listening to the Apollo broadcasts on the radio, dreaming of one day performing on that legendary stage. Success at the Apollo would prove that his experimental music could speak to black audiences, not just white college students in the village. But Jimi had misread both the Apollo audience and his own music. What worked in the integrated bohemian environment of Greenwich Village was not necessarily going to work in Harlem, where audiences expected black performers to deliver recognizable, soulful music that spoke directly to their community's experience. The trouble started before Jimi even played a note. When he walked onto the Apollo stage, carrying his Stratocaster and wearing his psychedelic shirt, the audience immediately sensed that something was off. This didn't look like a traditional R&B performer or soul singer. This looked like someone who had been influenced by white rock culture. The Apollo's master of ceremonies, a veteran entertainer named Ralph Cooper Jr., introduced Jimi James with the standard amateur night spiel, but even he seemed uncertain about what kind of performance they were about to witness. Jimi plugged in his guitar and began playing what would later become Purple Haze, though the song was still in its experimental stages. From the first note, it was clear that this was not what the Apollo audience expected or wanted. The guitar sound was wrong, too much distortion, too much feedback, too psychedelic. The rhythm was wrong, not quite blues, not quite rock, certainly not soul. And Jimi's stage presence, while magnetic, was influenced by the theatrical, almost mystical performance style he'd developed in the village, rather than the traditional call-and-response tradition of black entertainment.
Within 30 seconds, the first boos started. A few audience members in the balcony began expressing their disapproval, and their voices carried clearly through the theater. "What is this?" someone shouted. "This ain't music." But Jimmy continued playing, either not hearing the boos over his amplified guitar or choosing to ignore them. He was committed to his vision of what this performance could be, even as it became increasingly clear that the audience wasn't following him. The boos grew louder, more voices joined in, and the disapproval spread through the theater like wildfire. "Get that weird hippie off our stage," someone yelled from the orchestra section. "We don't want no psychedelic nonsense here." The criticism wasn't just about the music, it was about authenticity, community, and what it meant to be a black performer. The Apollo audience felt that Jimmy had somehow betrayed his racial identity by adopting musical styles and stage mannerisms associated with white rock culture. "That boy's confused," shouted an older woman in the front row. "Somebody needs to tell him he's black." The hostility reached a crescendo when Jimmy attempted one of his signature moves, playing the guitar behind his head. In the village clubs, this had always gotten a huge reaction from amazed audiences, but at the Apollo, it was seen as showboating, as putting style over substance. That's when the bottles started flying. It began with a single beer bottle thrown from the balcony, which shattered near Jimmy's feet. Then more projectiles followed, programs, shoes, even someone's hat. The Apollo security, experienced in handling hostile crowds, began moving toward the stage. Ralph Cooper Jr., seeing that the situation was getting dangerous, made the call. He walked out onto the stage, raised his hand for quiet, and said the words that no Apollo performer ever wanted to hear. "Thank you, Jimmy James. Let's give him a hand, folks." It was the polite but unmistakable hook. Jimmy's performance was over after less than 2 minutes on stage. He had been booed off the Apollo stage in one of the most brutal rejections in the theater's history. As Jimmy unplugged his guitar and walked off stage, the boos continued. Some audience members were still shouting criticisms. "Learn some real music. Come back when you figure out who you are. That's what happens when you try to be white." Backstage, Jimmy was devastated. Other performers waiting for their turns looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and wariness. Sympathy for the humiliation he'd just endured, but wariness about being associated with someone who had just bombed so spectacularly. The Apollo's backstage manager, a kind but practical man named Eddie Murphy, tried to console Jimmy. "Don't take it personal, son," Eddie said. "This audience just knows what they like, and they're not shy about letting you know when you miss the mark." But Jimmy knew it was more than just missing the mark. He had been rejected by his own community, dismissed as inauthentic, and told that his musical vision was somehow a betrayal of his racial identity. It was one of the most painful experiences of his life. The story of Jimmy's Apollo disaster spread quickly through New York's music scene. In the village clubs where he regularly performed, some people were sympathetic, understanding that the Apollo represented a different kind of audience with different expectations. But others began questioning whether Jimmy's music was really as universal as he claimed. For Jimmy, the Apollo rejection became a source of deep insecurity. He began wondering if his critics were right, if he had somehow lost touch with his roots in pursuit of musical innovation. The question haunted him. Could he be a successful rock musician and still be authentically black? This internal struggle would continue as Jimmy moved to London and achieved international success. Even as he became one of the biggest rock stars in the world, he carried with him the memory of being booed off the Apollo stage by his own people. But the story was far from over. By April 1968, everything had changed. Jimi Hendrix, no longer Jimmy James, had become an international sensation. His albums had sold millions of copies worldwide. He had headlined major festivals, appeared on television shows, and been proclaimed by critics as the greatest guitarist alive. Most importantly for the Apollo story, Jimmy had also begun to find acceptance within the black community. His success had forced a reevaluation of what black music could sound like, and many of the same people who had once criticized him were beginning to recognize his genius. The Apollo Theater's management, led by general manager Frank Schiffman, had been watching Jimmy's rise with growing interest and, frankly, growing embarrassment.
The theater that prided itself on discovering talent had not only failed to recognize a future superstar, they had actively rejected him in the most public way possible. When Jimi's performances made him a cultural icon, Schiffman realized that the Apollo needed to make amends. Having Jimi Hendrix return to the Apollo would not only be a major commercial success, but it would also restore the theater's reputation as a place that understood and supported innovative black artists. But there was a problem. Jimi was booked solid for months in advance, commanding fees that were astronomical by Apollo standards. More importantly, it wasn't clear that he would want to return to the venue where he had experienced such humiliation. Schiffman decided that extraordinary circumstances called for extraordinary measures. In April 1968, he personally flew to London, where Jimi was performing a series of sold-out concerts. The meeting between Schiffman and Jimi took place in a hotel suite in London's Mayfair district. Also present were Jimi's manager and representatives from his record label, all curious to see what the Apollo wanted. Schiffman was direct. "Jimi, we made a mistake, a big mistake. That night in '66, our audience didn't understand what you were trying to do, but now they do. Now the whole world does. We want you to come back to the Apollo, not as an amateur, but as the star you've become." Jimi listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When Schiffman finished his pitch, Jimi asked the simple question, "Why should I?" It was a fair question. Jimi was selling out arenas across Europe and America. He didn't need the Apollo's validation anymore, and he certainly didn't need the money they could offer. Schiffman's answer revealed why he had flown across the Atlantic to make this request in person. Because the Apollo represents your community. The people who booed you that night, they weren't rejecting you personally. They were rejecting what they didn't understand. Now they understand. They want to celebrate you. They want to claim you as their own. The conversation continued for over an hour. Jimi asked tough questions about the Apollo's commitment to supporting innovative black artists. He wanted assurance that other experimental musicians wouldn't face the same rejection he had experienced. Finally, Jimi agreed to return, but with conditions. He would perform 2 shows, but the Apollo would have to donate a portion of the proceeds to music education programs in Harlem. He also insisted that the opening acts include other black rock musicians who were struggling to find acceptance in traditional R&B venues. The announcement that Jimi Hendrix would return to the Apollo Theater created a sensation in the music world. Tickets for both shows sold out within hours, with some fans paying unprecedented prices on the secondary market. The return performance was scheduled for September 5, 1968, almost exactly 2 years after his disastrous amateur night appearance. As the date approached, anticipation built throughout Harlem. This wasn't just a concert, it was a cultural event. The community that had once rejected Jimi was preparing to welcome him back as a conquering hero. The night of the show, the atmosphere outside the Apollo was electric. Fans lined up for blocks, many wearing psychedelic clothing that would have seemed alien in Harlem just 2 years earlier. The demographic was notably different from typical Apollo audiences, younger, more diverse, more open to musical experimentation. Inside the theater, the energy was palpable. Many audience members had been present for Jimi's original rejection, and they understood the historical significance of this moment. When Jimi walked onto the Apollo stage for the second time, the reception was overwhelming. Before he played a single note, the audience erupted in thunderous applause that lasted for several minutes. Some people were crying, others were cheering, and everyone seemed to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Jimi's performance that night was transcendent. He played many of his hits, but he also included several traditional blues numbers that demonstrated his deep connection to the music that had influenced him. He showed the Apollo audience that his experimental rock style grew out of the same roots that nourished all great black music. The highlight of the evening came when Jimmy performed a slow, soulful blues song that showcased his traditional guitar skills alongside his innovative techniques. The Apollo audience, many of whom were hearing this side of his music for the first time, responded with the kind of enthusiastic call and response that the theater was famous for. When the show ended, the standing ovation lasted for 10 minutes. Jimmy, visibly moved by the reception, addressed the audience directly. "2 years ago, you told me I didn't belong here. Tonight, you've welcomed me home. Thank you for giving me the chance to grow and for growing with me." The success of Jimmy's return to the Apollo had implications far beyond that single concert. It represented a broader acceptance within the Black community of musical innovation and artistic boundary crossing. Other experimental Black musicians found that doors were opening for them that had been closed before. The Apollo, for its part, learned a valuable lesson about the importance of supporting artistic innovation even when it challenged conventional expectations. The theater began featuring more diverse programming and became more open to artists who didn't fit traditional categories. Frank Schiffman later said that bringing Jimmy back to the Apollo was one of the most important decisions of his career. "We had to admit we were wrong, and we had to prove that we could change." Jimmy taught us that growth requires the courage to reconsider our assumptions. The financial success of Jimmy's return concerts was unprecedented. Both shows broke attendance records, and the Apollo's profits from those 2 nights exceeded what they typically made in an entire month. More importantly, the concerts established the Apollo as a venue willing to embrace musical evolution rather than clinging to traditional formats. Today, the Apollo Theater's Wall of Fame includes a prominent display about Jimi Hendrix, acknowledging both his initial rejection and his triumphant return. The display includes the quote that has become legendary in Apollo history: "Great artists aren't always understood the first time. Sometimes the audience needs to grow into the music."
The story of Jimmy's Apollo rejection and redemption became a powerful symbol of how communities can evolve, how artistic vision can triumph over initial misunderstanding, and how the courage to return to places that once rejected you can lead to profound transformation for everyone involved. For young artists facing rejection, Jimmy's Apollo story offers hope. Today's boos can become tomorrow's standing ovations if you have the courage to continue growing and the wisdom to give your audience time to grow with you. The key is never letting rejection define your worth, but using it as fuel to prove that great art transcends initial misunderstanding. The Apollo Theater learned that supporting artistic innovation, even when it challenges expectations, is essential for remaining culturally relevant. Jimi Hendrix learned that sometimes you have to leave your community to find yourself, but coming home with new wisdom can heal old wounds and create new possibilities. If this incredible story of perseverance, growth, and ultimate vindication inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more amazing true stories about artists who refuse to give up. Have you ever returned to a place that once rejected you and found acceptance? Share your story in the comments below, and remember to give this video a thumbs up if you believe that great art is worth fighting for, even when it takes time for the world to understand it.